You won't want to miss this. Before we jump in, hit subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. Jake Manning woke to the sound of laughter. A rich, melodious laugh, soft but undeniable, carried through the still night air. Blinking groggily, he rolled over and glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. His dreams had been vivid tonight. Something about his garden and a sky full of stars. The scent of tomatoes lingered in his memory, but that sound, it felt too real. He sat up and listened carefully. The laughter came again, faint but distinct, drifting in through the open window. A shiver of unease ran down his spine. Jake lived alone, and his house, a modest suburban property tucked at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, wasn't the kind of place where strange noises cropped up often. Sliding out of bed, he grabbed his flashlight and pulled on his jacket. The night felt unusually cold for late summer as he crept downstairs and peered out the kitchen window. His garden stretched before him, bathed in moonlight. He'd spent months nurturing those plants: tomatoes, beans, peppers, squash. His uncle had taught him everything he knew about gardening before passing away the year before, leaving Jake with the house and a wealth of horticultural knowledge. But now something was wrong. A faint glow illuminated the far corner of the garden, and shadows moved among the plants. Jake squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A figure crouched near the tomato vines, bathed in an otherworldly light. The figure reached out, plucking a ripe tomato and holding it to their chest. Jake's anger flared. Months of hard work, only for some petty thief to raid his garden in the middle of the night? He grabbed the nearest thing, a rake, and stormed outside, his heart pounding. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice sharp in the stillness. "Get away from my garden!" The figure froze, then turned slowly to face him. Jake skidded to a halt, his grip on the rake tightening. It wasn't the appearance of the thief that startled him. It was their inhumanity. The figure was a woman, but not like any woman Jake had ever seen. Her skin shimmered with a deep, ethereal violet hue that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Waves of starlight cascaded down her back, her hair shifting with a fluid motion that defied gravity. Most striking of all were her eyes, glowing like twin amethysts caught in moonlight, staring at him with equal parts curiosity and fear. Jake's breath caught. He must still be dreaming. There was no other explanation. But the cold bite of the rake's handle against his palm told him otherwise. The woman clutched 3 ripe tomatoes to her chest, her movements slow and deliberate as if to show she meant no harm. "I can explain," she said, her voice melodic, each word carrying an accent he couldn't place. "Your vegetables called to me." Jake blinked. Of all the possible excuses he'd imagined for a garden thief, that wasn't one of them. "My vegetables called to you?" he repeated, incredulous. "Yes." She took a careful step back, her glowing eyes darting between Jake and the rake. "They sing with such vitality, especially these." She held up one of the tomatoes, its dark purple skin gleaming in the dim light. "The flavor profile is quite extraordinary." Jake lowered the rake slightly, his initial anger giving way to confusion. "You couldn't just knock on the door and ask." Her expression softened, a hint of embarrassment crossing her alien features. "Your sign clearly states no soliciting," she said, pointing toward the porch with a graceful violet finger. "I assumed that meant no asking." Jake let out a laugh despite himself, the absurdity of the situation bubbling to the surface. "That's for salespeople, not people who want to borrow tomatoes." "Ah!" She tilted her head, her hair shifting like liquid starlight. "Earth customs are rather confusing. Although," she added with a sly smile, "borrow implies I intended to return them, which would be impossible given their intended purpose." "Which is?" "Consumption, obviously." Her smile widened, lighting up her face in a way that made Jake's heart skip unexpectedly. He shook his head, unsure whether to laugh or question his sanity. "Right. Well, I don't suppose you'd be willing to pretend you never saw me." A sharp buzzing sound interrupted them, cutting through the quiet night. Jake glanced upward to see a drone hovering above the garden, its crimson light sweeping the area. The woman's expression shifted instantly from amusement to fear. She dropped the tomatoes, pressing herself against the garden wall in an attempt to merge with the shadows. Jake stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Are you in trouble?" "No," she said, then immediately corrected herself. "Yes, perhaps. It's complicated." The drone made another pass, lower this time, its mechanical hum growing louder. Without thinking, Jake moved to block its view, positioning his body between the machine and the strange woman. He stared it down until it hovered briefly, then zoomed away toward the next block. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice trembling. "That was unexpectedly kind." Jake shrugged, trying to ignore the racing of his heart. "Yeah, well, anyone who appreciates my tomatoes can't be all bad." She blinked at him, her glowing eyes searching his face as if trying to decipher his motives. "You'd invite a stranger, clearly non-human, into your home after catching her stealing from you." When she put it that way, it did sound pretty stupid. But Jake found himself saying, "It's either that, or we keep talking about alien produce theft in my backyard where the neighbors might see. Mrs. Henderson next door already thinks I'm weird for growing purple tomatoes. This would probably push her over the edge." A smile flickered across the woman's face again, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're either the kindest person I've met on this planet or the most foolish. Why not both?" Jake gestured toward the back door. "Come on. I'll make some tea. We'll figure out what's going on." The woman hesitated, her gaze flitting toward the sky where the drone had disappeared. Then, with a sigh, she followed him inside. "My name is Alara," she said softly as she stepped through the door. "Professional tomato thief, apparently." "Jake Manning," he replied. "And you're the weirdest thing that's happened to me since I started growing heirloom vegetables." In the warmth of the kitchen, the surreal nature of the moment only deepened. Alara perched on one of the wooden chairs, her silver garment shimmering under the fluorescent light. She accepted the tea Jake offered with a look of childlike wonder, holding the mug delicately as if it were an artifact. "This is remarkable," she said after a careful sip. "What do you call this blend?" "Earl Grey," Jake replied, unable to suppress a smile. "Pretty standard stuff." Alara studied the steam curling from the mug, her expression suddenly serious. "You're wondering why I'm here?" Jake nodded, leaning against the counter. "And not just for the tomatoes, I'm guessing." She placed the mug down with deliberate care, folding her hands in her lap. "The truth is, I'm not supposed to be here. On Earth, I mean. Or anywhere outside the places I'm told to be." "And who tells you where to be?" Jake asked cautiously. Her glowing eyes met his, and he felt a pang of unease. "The people who made me," she said simply. The weight of her words hung between them, heavy with implications Jake couldn't yet grasp. For a moment, the quiet hum of the house was the only sound, broken only by Alara's whispered confession. "I didn't choose this." Jake leaned back in his chair, gripping the mug of tea as Alara's words echoed in his mind. "The people who made me." Her voice, normally melodic, carried a bitterness that tugged at the edges of his curiosity. He studied her as she sat across from him, her glowing violet skin and shimmering silver garment more surreal under the warm fluorescent kitchen lights. "Made you?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you mean by that?" Alara hesitated, her luminous fingers tracing the rim of her mug. Her amethyst eyes flicked toward the window, as if checking for more drones. "My kind are not born," she said softly, her voice tinged with resignation. "We are designed. Engineered." Jake frowned. "Engineered for what?" Her gaze met his, unflinching. "Diplomacy. Negotiation. Connection. My official designation is a Diplomatic Interface Unit, or DIU. My purpose is to foster communication and understanding between different species. Zenite Corporation, the entity that created me, specializes in first contact negotiations. They ensure that misunderstandings don't lead to conflict, whether between alien civilizations or corporate interests. The explanation was clinical, almost detached, but Jake could sense an undercurrent of anger beneath her calm exterior. "So, you're like a translator," he ventured. "More than that," Alara said, shaking her head. "My creators ensured I would be universally appealing." She gestured toward her violet skin and shimmering hair. This form was carefully designed to fall within the aesthetic preferences of most sentient species. My voice, my mannerisms, even my scent, everything about me was crafted to put others at ease, to make them trust me. Jake leaned forward, setting his mug on the table. "And you're okay with that? Just being a tool for them?" Alara's lips tightened. "I used to be. When I first became self-aware, I believed it was my duty to fulfill the purpose for which I was created. I didn't question the orders I was given or the missions I was sent on." Her voice dropped, tinged with a bitterness that made Jake's chest ache. "But then I began to notice things. Details they didn't want me to see. I started to question my creator's intentions." "What kind of details?" Jake asked. She hesitated, glancing again at the window before lowering her voice. "The Zenite Corporation has no real interest in diplomacy. They only care about control, whether through negotiation or force. They want to dominate the galaxy's trade routes, seize resources, and expand their influence. And my kind, we're part of their plan." Jake frowned. "How?" Alara took a deep breath, her fingers curling tightly around the mug. "Zenite created us to be diplomatic tools, but they've found other uses for us. Uses that go far beyond negotiation. We're connected to life itself, plants, animals, even ecosystems. We can sense and influence living things. They're developing ways to weaponize that ability." Jake sat back, stunned. "You mean, they want to turn you into a weapon?" She nodded grimly. "Imagine using someone like me to destabilize an enemy colony, to sow chaos in their food supplies or disrupt their ecosystems. I discovered prototypes of weapons based on my abilities, devices that could destroy entire biospheres in days. When I confronted my overseers, they told me it was a necessary evolution of our purpose." Jake's anger flared. "And they just expected you to go along with it. They didn't expect me to have a choice." Her voice wavered slightly, and she lowered her gaze. "We're not supposed to have self-awareness. It's considered an unintended flaw in our design. When I refused to comply, they marked me as defective and attempted to shut me down." Jake's breath caught. "You mean they tried to kill you?" "To them, I'm not alive," Alara said quietly. "I'm property, a product. Disposing of me is no different than decommissioning a faulty machine." She looked up, her glowing eyes locking onto Jake's. "That's why I ran. I couldn't stay and let them use me to harm others. And I couldn't let them destroy me for refusing." Jake was silent for a moment, trying to process everything. He'd thought his life was complicated before, but now he was sitting across from a fugitive alien who'd been hunted by her creators for daring to defy them. The weight of her story pressed down on him, but so did the urgency of their situation. "What happened after you escaped?" he asked finally. Alara's expression darkened. "I stole a small transport ship during a diplomatic function on Mars. My plan was to reach the free territories in the Outer Rim, where Zenite's influence doesn't extend. But my ship's navigation system was damaged during the escape. I've been planet-hopping ever since, trying to stay ahead of their recovery teams." Jake glanced toward the window, his unease growing. "And those drones, they're part of the recovery teams?" She nodded. "Zenite uses synthetic enforcement units to track down runaways like me. They're relentless. They'll search every corner of this sector until they find me." Jake's mind raced. His quiet, ordinary life had just been turned upside down. He'd invited this fugitive into his home, and now he was caught in the middle of a corporate hunt. But as he looked at Alara, her fear barely masked by her calm demeanor, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. "Why'd you stop here?" he asked, his voice soft. Her violet skin flushed slightly, and she looked away. "I was hungry," she admitted. "And tired. Your garden. It called to me." Jake couldn't help but smile. "My garden called to you." My kind can sense the life force in plants, she explained. Yours are particularly vibrant. You must care for them deeply. Jake's chest tightened. They're all I have left of my uncle, he said quietly. He taught me everything I know about gardening. When he passed away, I inherited the house and the garden. Alara's gaze softened. Loss echoes differently in every species, but it always leaves marks, she said gently. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. Jake found himself wondering how someone engineered for diplomacy could feel so human. A sudden scratching sound broke the silence. Both of them turned toward the window as a small drone hovered outside, its crimson eye scanning the kitchen. Alara went completely still, her breathing shallow. Jake stood casually, as if stretching, and pulled the blinds shut. How many of those things are after you? He asked. Enough to blanket this entire sector of your planet, she said softly. Jake let out a low whistle. And they won't stop until they find you. No, she wrapped her arms around herself, her silver garment rippling like liquid mercury. I shouldn't have stopped here. I'm putting you in danger. Hey, I invited you in, remember? Jake said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Alara's gaze met his, and her expression turned grim. They could classify you as an accomplice to corporate property theft, she said bluntly. Seize your assets, eliminate you, or use you as leverage to force my return. Jake stared at her, his stomach twisting. Great. Thanks for the warning. I'm told humans prefer not to discuss such possibilities directly, she added with a faint, apologetic smile. Yeah, we usually dance around the whole death and destruction thing. Jake muttered, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation pressed down on Jake, but so did an inexplicable sense of resolve. He didn't know what he was getting himself into, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn her away. Well, he said finally, if we're going to survive this, we'd better come up with a plan. Alara's expression softened, a glimmer of hope in her luminous eyes. You're either very brave or very foolish, she said quietly. Jake managed a wry smile. Why not both? The next morning, Jake woke to a quiet house. He lay in bed for a few moments, staring at the ceiling, his mind heavy with everything Alara had revealed the night before. Somewhere downstairs, there was an alien fugitive who could nurture life with a touch and was being hunted by a corporation that wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. It felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare, but the faint hum of drones buzzing outside his window reminded him that it was all too real. Dragging himself out of bed, Jake pulled on a pair of jeans and headed downstairs. He found Alara in the kitchen, her appearance altered to look human. Pale skin, dark hair, and an almost convincing aura of normalcy. Yet, even in disguise, she carried an otherworldly grace that made her stand out. She turned when he entered, holding a mug of coffee in her hands. Good morning, she said, her voice soft but steady. Jake nodded, still waking up. Morning. You slept okay? Well enough, she replied, though the faint shadows under her eyes suggested otherwise. Your home is quiet. I'm not used to quiet. Jake filled his own mug and sat at the table across from her. I'm guessing you don't get a lot of downtime when you're running for your life. She smiled faintly, but her expression quickly turned serious. We can't stay here for long. The agents will come back, and when they do, they'll be more aggressive. Jake sighed. I figured. So, what's the plan? Alara reached into the folds of her silver garment, which she'd hidden beneath a loose hoodie Jake had lent her. She pulled out a small crystal-like device, its surface cracked and dark. This is a communication relay, she explained. If I can repair it, I might be able to contact allies, others who've escaped Zenite or those who oppose their control. They could help us. Jake leaned closer to examine the device. What's wrong with it? The energy core is damaged, Alara said, her tone grim. It needs a specific type of material to function, a crystalline compound that's rare and highly regulated on most planets. On Earth, it would be considered advanced technology. Jake frowned. So, where do we find it? Alara hesitated before replying. There's a black market tech dealer in the city. He operates under the guise of an electronics repair shop. If we can reach him, he might have what we need. Jake sat back, rubbing his temples. A black market tech dealer. Great. That's exactly what I needed in my life. I know it's a risk, Alara said, her voice earnest. But it's our best chance. Without the relay, we're on our own. Jake stared at the cracked crystal, weighing his options. It was insane. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to walk away. But he couldn't shake the memory of Alara's glowing eyes, her fear, and her quiet determination to fight back against those who sought to use her as a weapon. Okay, he said finally. I'll go. Alara blinked, surprised. You? Yeah. You're the one they're looking for, Jake pointed out. If you show up in the city, you'll get caught in no time. I'll go to the dealer, get what you need, and bring it back here. Alara's lips parted as if to argue, but she stopped herself. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a second crystal, this one intact. She twisted its base, revealing a hidden compartment filled with small, iridescent stones. Quantum-compressed diamonds, she explained, handing the stones to Jake. They're untraceable and valuable on almost any planet. The dealer will recognize them as currency. Jake pocketed the stones and stood, grabbing his keys. All right. While I'm gone, try to stay out of sight. Mrs. Henderson's probably already watching the house through her curtains. I'll be careful, Alara promised. As Jake headed for the door, she called after him, Jake. He turned, meeting her gaze. Thank you, she said softly. Jake managed a faint smile. Don't thank me yet. Let's see if I survive this first. The city was a stark contrast to the quiet suburb Jake called home. Towering skyscrapers loomed overhead, their glass facades reflecting the midday sun. The streets buzzed with life, cars honking, pedestrians rushing past, the occasional street vendor shouting about their wares. Jake kept his head down, clutching the small piece of paper Alara had given him with the dealer's address. He felt exposed, hyper-aware of every movement around him. Were Zenite's agents watching? Had they tracked him here? The electronics repair shop was unassuming, wedged between a laundromat and a convenience store. A faded sign above the door read TechFix Solutions, and the windows were covered with posters advertising phone repairs and computer upgrades. Jake hesitated before stepping inside. The air smelled faintly of solder and grease, and shelves lined with mismatched electronics gave the place a cluttered, chaotic feel. A man stood behind the counter, his appearance as unassuming as the shop itself. He wore a grease-stained jumpsuit and thick glasses, his graying hair tied back in a messy ponytail. He looked up as Jake entered, his sharp eyes assessing him immediately. Help you? The man asked gruffly. Jake approached the counter, lowering his voice. I'm looking for something specific. A crystalline energy core. For a comm relay. The man's expression didn't change, but Jake noticed the way his eyes flicked toward the front door, then back to him. We don't sell that kind of thing here. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the iridescent stones, setting it on the counter. The man's eyes narrowed, and he leaned closer to examine it. You've got my attention, he said after a moment. What's it for? Jake hesitated. Let's just say it's important. The man studied him for a long moment before nodding. Wait here. He disappeared into a back room, leaving Jake alone with the cluttered shelves and the faint hum of machinery. Jake's nerves buzzed. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. When the man returned, he held a small, clear crystal in his hand. It pulsed faintly with an inner light. This is what you need, he said, placing it on the counter. Jake handed over the rest of the diamonds, his heart pounding with relief. But as he reached for the crystal, the man grabbed his wrist. Word of advice, the man said, his voice low. Whatever you're mixed up in, be careful. People who come looking for this kind of tech usually end up dead. Jake swallowed hard. Thanks for the tip. He pocketed the crystal and left the shop, his heart racing. Back at the house, Alara paced the living room, her anxiety evident in the way her hands twisted together. She stopped when she heard Jake's car pull into the driveway, rushing to meet him at the door. "You got it?" she asked breathlessly. Jake pulled the crystal from his pocket and handed it to her. One genuine, illegal energy core, as requested. Relief washed over Alara's face. "Thank you." She set to work immediately, carefully dismantling the damaged relay on the kitchen table. Jake watched as her fingers moved with precision, her focus unshakable. "What happens once you get this working?" he asked. Alara didn't look up. "I'll send a distress signal to my allies. If they receive it, they'll come for me. They'll help me escape Zenite's reach." "And what about me?" Jake asked quietly. "What happens if they figure out I helped you?" Alara paused, her hands trembling slightly. She looked up, her expression filled with guilt. "I never wanted to put you in danger, Jake. If they come for you, I'll do everything I can to protect you. I promise." Jake nodded, but the weight of her words lingered. He wasn't sure what he'd gotten himself into, but there was no turning back now. As night fell, the repaired relay hummed softly on the kitchen table, its crystal core glowing with a faint light. Alara's fingers hovered over the device, her expression unreadable. "Ready?" Jake asked. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's hope this works." With a single touch, she activated the relay. A soft chime echoed through the room, followed by a burst of light as the signal was sent. For a moment, everything was still. Then the hum of drones returned, louder and more insistent. Jake's stomach sank as he glanced out the window. "They are here," he said grimly. Alara's expression hardened. "Then we fight." The hum of drones grew louder, a mechanical swarm circling above Jake's house like predators scenting their prey. Jake peered through the window, his heart sinking. Red lights danced across the darkened street, sweeping over lawns and fences as synthetic enforcers searched for their target. "They're not wasting any time," Jake muttered, his hands tightening into fists. Alara stood beside him, her human disguise fading as her nerves frayed. Her violet skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, and her glowing amethyst eyes reflected the movement outside. "They've triangulated the signal," she said softly, her voice calm despite the tension in the air. "It's only a matter of minutes before they move in." Jake turned to her, his voice low but firm. "Can't we just shut the relay down? Hide you somewhere?" Alara shook her head. "They've already locked onto my location. Even if I run, they'll burn this place to the ground to ensure I don't escape." Her eyes flicked to the kitchen table, where the repaired relay pulsed faintly. "The signal has been sent. My allies will come, but we have to hold out until then." Jake clenched his jaw, glancing around the room. "So, what's the plan? Do we just wait for them to bust through the door and hope for the best?" Alara hesitated, then took a step toward him. "There is something I can do," she said slowly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "But it's risky, and it might put you in even more danger." Jake met her gaze. "Risky how?" Alara hesitated, then lifted her hand. The air around her fingertips seemed to shimmer, and a delicate vine sprouted from her palm, curling upward. Within seconds, the vine bloomed with tiny flowers that glowed faintly in the dark. "My connection to life, the ability to foster growth, isn't just limited to plants," she explained. "I can influence ecosystems, accelerate their growth, strengthen them." Her voice dropped. "I could use this house, this garden, as a conduit. Create a defense they won't expect." Jake stared at the vine, his mind racing. "You mean, turn the garden into some kind of weapon?" "Not a weapon," Alara corrected. "A sanctuary. One they can't penetrate. But to do it, I'd need to draw on every bit of life energy in the area. The garden, the trees, the soil itself. It would take everything I have. And once I start, I won't be able to stop until it's done." Jake took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling over him. He glanced at the window, where the red lights of the drones continued to sweep closer. "Do it," he said firmly. Alara's eyes widened. Jake! You said it yourself, he interrupted. If we don't do something, they'll destroy everything anyway. If this is our best shot, then we take it. Alara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, her resolve hardening. Stay close to me, she said. She stepped into the center of the room, lifting her arms as her skin began to glow brighter. The air seemed to hum with energy, and a faint warmth spread through the house. Jake watched in as vines began to crawl along the walls, their growth impossibly fast. Flowers bloomed in vivid bursts of color, their petals releasing a faint, luminous mist that filled the room with a heady, earthy scent. Outside, the drones began to converge, their mechanical hum growing louder. A sharp knock sounded at the front door, followed by a cold, mechanical voice. Mr. Manning, it said. This is Zenite Security. Surrender the fugitive immediately, or we will be forced to take action. Jake's stomach clenched, but he didn't move. Alara's glowing eyes met his, and he gave her a small nod. I hope this works, he muttered. Alara closed her eyes, her entire body radiating light. The vines surged outward, breaking through the walls and spreading into the garden. Outside, the plants seemed to come alive, twisting and growing with unnatural speed. Thick roots erupted from the ground, curling around the legs of the approaching drones. Trees bent and swayed, their branches lashing out like living whips. The drones fired their weapons, but the plants seemed to absorb the blasts, their growth only accelerating. Within moments, the house was surrounded by a living fortress of greenery, an impenetrable wall of vines, roots, and flowers. The Zenite agents, their dark suits now covered in glowing spores, attempted to push forward, but the plants resisted, ensnaring them with unrelenting force. One of the agents raised a weapon, only to have it wrenched from his hands by a twisting vine. Inside, Jake could feel the energy pulsing through the house. The air was thick with life, every surface alive with movement. He turned to Alara, who stood at the center of it all, her eyes glowing like twin stars. Are you okay? He asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the plants. I can hold them off, she replied, her voice strained but steady. But it won't last forever. We need to buy more time. As if on cue, a deafening roar filled the air, followed by a blinding flash of light. Jake shielded his eyes, his heart pounding. What was that? He shouted. Alara's eyes widened in alarm. They've called in reinforcements. Larger drones. More firepower. Jake clenched his fists, his mind racing. Then we need to stall them somehow. Alara hesitated, then reached out and touched his arm. Her skin was warm, and a faint vibration pulsed through him. Jake, she said softly, you've already done so much. I can't ask you to risk your life any further. Jake met her gaze, his expression firm. I'm not leaving you, Alara. We're in this together. Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed from outside. The larger drones had arrived, their heavy weapons tearing through the outer layers of the garden's defenses. Alara staggered slightly, the strain of maintaining the barrier beginning to show. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't fight the drones, but maybe he could outthink them. He grabbed a metal pipe from the kitchen and darted toward the front door. Jake, wait! Alara called, but he didn't stop. Outside, the larger drones were bearing down on the house, their weapons glowing with energy. Jake ran toward them, raising the pipe above his head. Hey! He shouted. Over here, you tin cans. The drones turned toward him, their red lights locking onto his figure. Jake's heart pounded, but he held his ground. Come and get me, he yelled. The drones fired, but Jake darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast. He ran toward the edge of the yard, drawing the drones away from the house. Meanwhile, inside, Alara channeled the last of her energy into the barrier, strengthening it as much as she could. She glanced toward the window, her heart sinking as she saw Jake dodging the drone's attacks. Jake, she whispered, her voice filled with anguish. Suddenly, a new sound filled the air, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Alara's eyes widened in recognition. "They are here," she said softly. Above the house, a sleek, alien ship appeared, its hull gleaming with an otherworldly light. The drones turned toward it, their weapons ready, but the ship fired a pulse of energy that disabled them instantly. Jake froze, his chest heaving as he watched the drones collapse around him. The ship descended, and a group of figures emerged, tall, luminous beings with features similar to Alara's. One of them stepped forward, their glowing eyes scanning the scene. "Alara," they said, their voice filled with relief. "We received your signal." Alara stepped outside, her body trembling with exhaustion. She smiled faintly as the figure approached. "You came," she said softly. The figure nodded. "We'll take you to safety. Zenite won't find you again." Alara turned to Jake, her expression bittersweet. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Jake swallowed hard. "Will I ever see you again?" Alara hesitated, then reached out and touched his hand. "I'll find you," she promised. As the ship ascended, Jake stood in the garden, now a vibrant, living sanctuary. The vines and flowers seemed to hum with life, a testament to the extraordinary visitor who had changed his life forever. For the first time in years, Jake felt something new, hope,